Hello, my name's International Master Andrew Martin, and I'd like to bid you a warm welcome to this Teach Yourself Chess series, the sole purpose of which is to turn you into a much better chess player. Now, there are 5 parts to this series. On this first DVD I'll be looking at basic chess, and then I'll be going on to look at tactics, strategy and planning, attack and defence, and we'll finish with the endgame. By the time you've completed this course, I hope you'll feel confident to go on out there and play a much better game of chess. Alright, it's time to get on with the show. Let's go. Hello, I'm International Master Andrew Martin, and I'm also the manager of coaching for the English Chess Federation. I'd like to welcome you to this series of DVDs which will help you surely to improve your chess. And the first of these DVDs is called Basic Chess, where I introduce you to the rudiments of the game. Now, in front of you here we see the chessboard. The chessboard has 64 squares, 32 of which are light and 32 of which are dark. Note that a white corner square should always lie on white's right hand, hence the saying, white on the right. Each square has a number and a letter attached to it, and this helps us when we want to write our own games out or read chess books and magazines. And the system is meant to be as easy as possible to understand. Now, if you look round the perimeter of the board, you will see that there are letters beneath the board, A to H, and numbers at the side of the board, 1 to 8. The board is thus a grid, and in order to find the name of any given square, you simply join up the letter and the number. Thus, if I just mark this square in green, that is the square D4. Easy to calculate. We have D and we have the number 4. Moving on, the square marked in red will be G6. It's on the G file and the 6th rank. We will come to consider these ideas of ranks and files in a moment. The final square I'm going to mark is B8. Once again, this is the B file and the 8th rank. So actually, recognition of squares is quite an easy task. As long as you remember you have to join up the letter and the number, it's easy to get the right square. Now, the chessboard is made up of ranks, files and diagonals. Ranks run horizontally and are marked with the red arrow. We would typically describe ranks as the first rank, the second rank, the third rank. I'm going to mark the third rank in yellow there, the 4th rank, 5th rank, etc. Files run vertically and are marked by the green arrow. Thus, you would typically describe files as the A file, the B file, the C file, the D file, E file, F file, etc. And diagonals, well, that's self-explanatory. They run diagonally and are marked by the yellow arrow. Again, if you are at all unsure about this concept, run over this section again until you are 100% ready to go on. Let's have a bit of practice now recognising squares before we go on. I've coloured a few squares on the chessboard. I wonder if you can name them. Try to name them before we go on. Alright, well, the squares marked in green, I hope you got this right, are C2 and D3. The squares marked in yellow are H1 and B4. In case you're forgetting how to work this out, just join up the letter with the number to get B4. And finally, the squares marked in red are H8 and A8. If you're not sure about this, have another go until you have mastered this idea. I'm sure you will pick it up quickly. Well, here we see the starting position of the game of chess. We know something about the board now. Let's go on to consider the pieces. Well, in chess there are 3 short range pieces and 3 long range pieces. The short range pieces are the pawn, the knight and the king. Each of these pieces moves slowly across the chessboard, and it's no secret that nominally they have the lowest value. The pawn is worth 1, the knight is supposed to be worth 3, and the king has no value at all, because as we know, if the king is checkmated, the game is over. Moreover, the king can never be taken. So therefore, it's a bit of a trick question if somebody asks you what is the value of the king. Well, it happens to be 0. The long range pieces are the rook, the queen and bishop. And once again, it's no secret that these pieces have the highest value. They simply move across the board very quickly. They can often decide the game through sheer power and force, and they should be used as aggressively as possible. The rook is worth 5. The queen is the most powerful piece you have. She is worth 9 points. And the bishop, this is a slightly controversial point. Many people have said that the bishop is only worth 3 points, roughly equivalent to the knight. I'm going to shade that to 3.5 points or 4 points. There are a lot more positions in chess where the bishop is more valuable than the knight. For instance, the knight is only more valuable than the bishop, or equivalent in value, when the position is blocked or the action is taking place on one side of the board only. So what you often find in chess is that the pieces complement each other. For instance, short range pieces often work well with long range pieces. It's no secret that the knight works extremely well with each of the bishop, queen and rook, but especially with the queen and rook. So if we understand how the pieces work and the way they blend in together, we're already taking a step along the road to understanding harmony in chess, which is of course a skill all the great players have. They know how to coordinate their pieces and make them work together to best effect. Checkmate ends the game. It's a good idea for young players and newcomers to the game to remember this, because in my experience they get more of a kick out of taking all the opponent's pieces. But even if you take all the other guy's pieces, you've still got to be able to checkmate. Checkmate ends the game, just remember that. So it's clear that some knowledge of the basic checkmates is crucial. So I'm going to take you through just a very few of them now. The first of these checkmates is extremely important because it crops up all the time in games between beginners. In practice, games between strong players end long before this position ever arises, because strong players understand the other guy can do this with his eyes shut. However, we have to know the technique, and it's very easy. Basically, there are 2 golden rules to remember. The first golden rule is always bring your king towards the enemy king wherever possible. So for instance, white to move would simply play king b2. Incidentally, the black king is going to be driven to the side of the board and mated there or in the corner. It's just a question of how this is done. Black sticks around in the centre. White can still bring his king up, highlighting the fact that the shortest route along the chessboard is along a diagonal. Black still sticks around in the centre, and now the second golden rule: bring up the king to cut off the enemy king. Bring up the queen to cut off the enemy king as much as possible. So, for instance, white's best move here, there are many moves, is queen f6, and now black's king is cut off from a huge amount of the board. In fact, black's already down to only 1 square. Well, that's 3 moves. Now white can't bring his king any closer, so white brings the queen up. No silly checks, and keep the queen within a knight's move of the enemy king. There we are. Now what is black to do? He's being driven backwards. Up comes the queen again. That's 5 moves, and after 5 moves we can see that the black king is driven to the back rank. Well, let's say black goes king e8. Okay, the very simplest move here is king d3, king d1, and now white has his choice of checkmates. He can go queen f1 checkmate, or he can go queen d2 checkmate. So it's really very simple. Points to remember: 1, bring up your king towards the enemy king wherever possible. Point number 2, systematically drive the king back by bringing your queen up, cutting off whole areas of the board as you do so. And watch out for stalemate at the end. If we just take play back, there are various ways for white to commit a howler in this position. For instance, look at this move, queen e3. This is exactly what you don't want to happen. This is stalemate. Black hasn't got a legal move, and his king is not in check. Instead of your hard-earned win, you're only going to end up with a draw. So this is the only danger, and I have seen it happen in young players' games. You know, they end up giving stalemate, and they can't really believe what's going on. They're still expecting to win a position like this. Well, as long as you exercise certain care in this position, you're going to win. And if you follow the techniques I've outlined, you're going to win in style. Well, having dealt with basic checkmate number 1, the lone queen, we now move to the lone rook, which again is very common in games between beginners or newcomers to chess, and you have to know how to do it. The idea is still the same. We're going to drive the black king towards the edge of the board and mate him there or in the corner. Same golden rules as before. Number 1, always bring up the king towards his king if you can. Black sticks around in the centre for as long as he can, and white brings the king up. Black sticks around. Okay, now white has to play a good rook move, and the best move that I can see in this position is rook e8. And the point of this is to stop the black king from venturing into half the board. The black king is now trapped in the same half of the board as the white king and has to give way, and this after only 3 moves. So as you can see, already we're understanding a bit about white's technique. He's not giving silly checks. A lot of beginners just start giving checks in this position. That's no plan to win the game. The plan is we're continually cutting down the number of squares that the black king has to move to. Alright, well, black's faced with an unenviable choice here. Let's say he goes king c5. Well, now again white moves in with a rook check. Black moves his king back to attack the rook, and now white moves the king up to protect the rook. So we've had now 5 moves. The black king is confined to a very small area of the board. Again, he has to give way, and white methodically makes progress with his rook. And now after only 7 moves, the black king is down to 6 squares. He stays off the edge for as long as possible. We bring our king in. We can always bring our king in when we want to. He goes back to b7, and now we can drive him to the edge of the board with rook to b5 check. And there are 2 variations. If he goes king c8, he's playing into our hands. As you can see, the black king has only got 1 square here, as long as white makes any sort of neutral move. So just to show you the power of the rook, I'm going to move it all the way back to b1. King goes to d8, and now the rook comes down to b8, checkmate. After rook b5 check, obviously black's got a slightly better option in playing king a6, but after king to c6, once again black's goose is completely cooked. He's driven all the way back into the corner, and now it's child's play for white to checkmate. Once again, I'll show the power of the rook by moving my rook away. The king must go into the corner, and now white moves his rook across, checkmate. So it's a systematic technique. It takes longer than with the queen, but it's very easy to learn it. Point number 1, always move the king towards his king if you can. Point number 2, take away squares and ranks files from him using the rook. You'll drive him into the corner and finish him off in this manner. Now we come to the next basic checkmate. I guess the idea of showing you these positions is to get you used to the properties of the pieces, what the pieces can do in simple situations. Here, funnily enough, I think this position is a bit of an optical illusion. It looks as though this should be difficult with the white pieces spread out. But in fact, the white bishops are already controlling an incredible amount of the board, and the black king is already actually confined. Now, how does white do this? Well, it's systematic once again. We cut off the black king using the bishops. We bring our own king in, and then we systematically drive him back into the corner. Let's just see if I can make this easier on the eye by moving the white bishops into a barrier like position. Now you can see that the black king is being cut off. The white bishops exert ferocious power from the centre of the board, and already after 2 accurate moves the black king is very confined. So the next stage is to bring up the king. It shouldn't be too difficult to understand what's going on here. White's just bringing up the king, and now it's time to start cutting the black king off. We should ask ourselves the question in this position, where don't we want black to go on the next turn? We don't want him to go to e6, so we cut him off from that square. Let's say he goes to c6. Where don't we want him to go on the next move? We don't want him to go here, so we cut him off. We've repositioned the barrier to our advantage. He goes to b6. Where don't we want him to go? Well, I don't especially want to see him on c6 in this position, so I will reposition the barrier yet again, and after 7 or 8 accurate moves, as you can see, the black king is already driven to the edge of the board. Okay, now it gets a little bit fiddly. We do not want the black king escaping in this position. Well, we can keep him confined with very simple moves such as king b4 and bishop d5. He has to go to the edge of the board, and now it gets a little bit fiddly, but the process is inexorable. We're closing in with the king. As you can see, he's down to 1 square. He goes back to a6. We play bishop c3. We didn't want him to come to a5. Once he's on the edge, we can keep him on the edge very simply. The barrier repositions for the final time. He has to go into the corner. All we do now is very simple. We give him a move, weak him with the bishop, and hey presto, after 18 moves the mate with the 2 bishops materialises. Now it may well be there were quicker ways. I don't know, if you use a computer you might find a better method than the one I've chosen for you, but I think that was fairly easy to understand. It was the same systematic method as before, using the king and bishops working together, and the notion of the barrier, the bishops side by side, is the best optical way to present this. It's the easiest on the eye to understand. If you don't understand this example, it doesn't crop up a lot, go back over it again until you do. My final basic checkmate is the worst nightmare for a lot of players, bishop and knight versus king. Basically because they don't take the trouble to learn it. I've seen even advanced players mess this up. They don't know the winning technique because well, it's a gap in their chess education. But I'm going to teach it to you now. I think it's important. It will teach you a lot about how to coordinate your pieces. Bishop and knight do separate jobs on the chessboard. How best do they work together? Well, we're going to see how they work together now. And the victim is going to be the black king. Now, if it was black to move in this position, of course, the king wouldn't be a victim at all because the position is stalemate. So it follows that, from white's point of view, the black king is in the wrong corner. White wants the opposing king in a corner which is the same colour as his bishop. So basically, he wants to drive black all the way to a8 or h1 in this position. And it's a question of how this is done. Well, it's done using the same systematic method as before. Let's start off with knight f7, king g8, and now importantly, white surrenders a tempo with bishop e4. He basically forces black to play king f8. The king is now walking in the wrong direction from black's point of view, and white now has to ask himself, where don't I want the black king to go on the next turn? Well, it's pretty clear he doesn't want him to come back to g8, which is heading towards the wrong corner again. So bishop h7 is the right move. And now you can see already, after 3 accurate moves, the black king is being driven across the board towards the desired corner on a8. Alright, now there's a tricky bit coming up, knight e5, and black plays his king to d8. Well, he could have gone to f8 in this position, but then white makes progress after knight d7, king e8, king e6, king d8, king d6, king e8, and now bishop g6 check. We'll encounter a similar position to this in the game, but at any rate you can see white is making considerable progress towards driving the black king towards the right colour corner. Now in the game, going back to knight e5, black tried to make a run for it with king d8. White plays king e6 and now king c7. And at this stage the beginner throws up his hands in horror and says, "Oh my god, I've let his king out." Well, that's not true. And white can set up a barrier in this position by putting his knight on the same colour square as the bishop, confining the black king. The idea is that the knight on light squares confines the black king, controlling all the dark squares, and the bishop on d3 again stops the king on c6 from escaping. We call this a barrier. The white pieces are 3 squares apart and the black king must go backwards. Now it's a question of, again, cutting the king off, so bishop e4. Now the black king is being increasingly denied squares. He goes back to d8, and now after king d6 we reach a very similar position to the one we were just looking at in the other variation. King goes to e8, bishop to g6. Again, note the white pieces on the same colour squares complementing each other. King d8 and now bishop h5, again surrendering a tempo in order to drive the black king to where we want him to go. Now comes the familiar knight manoeuvre, knight c5, king d8, knight b7, king c8 and now king c6. And as you can see, the black king would love to go to d8 in this position. Unfortunately for him, he can't, so he's got to go to b8, which is precisely where he doesn't want to go. Alright, on with the show. Bishop g4, king a7, and now this is a move weaker players have difficulty with, king c7, because again it seems as though the black king is being let out of the trap. But after bishop e2 check, for the 3rd time in this endgame, white has coordinated his pieces perfectly. The knight is complementing the bishop on the same colour square, controlling all black squares. The bishop's controlling white. The king must go back to a7, and for the final time the knight manoeuvre drives the king into the corner, and now the final loss of a tempo. King a7, knight c8 check, king a8, and now bishop c6 checkmate. When you see that done for the first time over the board, you think it's magic. But it's not magic, it's systematic, and I think if you don't understand it right away, you should perhaps go over this segment several times, because it will teach you a lot about how pieces work together. Now when we're starting out in chess, let's say we've learned how the pieces move, we've got a very, very basic idea of how to play the game. We need to understand some general principles. We need a basic grounding in the rudiments of chess. So what I'm going to do for you now is to give you a list of basic principles, and I'm going to try to show you how these principles work when set alongside an actual game. And the first basic principle which I want you to understand is that control of the centre in the opening is the most important thing. Play to control or occupy the centre of the board. The squares d4, e4, d5 and e5 are the most important squares, and we can extend the centre a little bit further to c4, c5, f4 and f5. You will see when you examine all games at a higher level that each of the players is endeavouring to conquer the central area of the board at the beginning. So this is why, coming on to the next principle, a good player will usually open with a central pawn. You often see white playing either e4, d4, c4 or maybe knight f3. These are the 4 most common opening moves because they directly influence play in the centre of the board. So the opening is a battle for the centre. Now just let's get rid of a few of these colours. There's a rule in chess that you should try to develop your knights before the bishops when you're thinking about getting your pieces out. Why is this? Well, simply because the knights can actually participate in the battle for the centre actually before the bishops. As we can see on the initial move, the knight can already jump out. White can already jump out with either of his knights. He either play his knight out to c3 if he wishes, or going back he may play knight f3. And already these knights are participating in this central struggle. The white knight, for instance, on f3 controls e5 and d4. and in particular restrains black's freeing advance e5. So knights before bishops is usually a good idea, and once again, if you come to examine most master games, you will see them bringing their knights out first. Occasionally the bishops come out before the knights, but it is much rarer. There's another rule which is important to understand. Move each piece once before you move a piece twice. The idea is that development is the key to success in the opening phase of the game. And what I mean by development is not lots of pawn moves. Piece moves are the key. A few pawn moves, lots of piece moves. Let's imagine you're the manager in charge of a football team. Well, you don't play a game of football with only 2 players on the pitch. You need your whole team out there involved in the battle. And that's exactly the same in chess. Success comes to the person who develops fastest and most accurately. Then they have a very good chance of getting the position if they do this. So develop quickly, accurately, few pawn moves, plenty of piece moves. Next thing, your king. Well, your king is one of the most important pieces, if not the most important piece on the chessboard. Long term, he certainly is the most important piece. So in the opening, it's very important to castle, to get your king to safety. Get the king out of the way before the initial skirmishes start, and then you have a freer hand. You can't actually attack the enemy. It's not logical to expect to be able to attack the enemy when you've still got a shaky king. So get the king to safety. That is a most important rule. The final idea I want you to consider is that if you attack prematurely, you're likely to be driven back. For instance, if I take back the move knight f3, and I'll just show you an example of premature attack. White bringing the queen out to h5. This is a typical beginner's move. I see this all the time in the games of young players. They become completely obsessed with the power of the queen, intoxicated, and they think it's very important to move the queen out early. Well, this may well work against a weaker player, against poor opposition. A poor player will just ignore what white is doing, think he can get away with attacking the queen, in comes the queen, and then black will lose a rook on h8. That's a very basic example of poor play by black after a premature attack by white. But instead, if black plays sensibly, just simply sticking to the basics, controlling the centre, noting the opponent's threats, developing a piece, protecting his pawn, then eventually white gets pushed back. First of all, the queen is being pushed back by the pawn, then the queen is being blocked out of the game by the knight. The queen pushes across to b3, renewing the threat to f7, while black defends patiently, and now black is getting ready for key moves such as knight d4. The only thing that's happened to white after his premature queen adventure is that he is losing time. So beware the premature attack. Alright, let's just review these one more time, these principles, before we go on, and then I'll look at each of them in turn a bit more closely. 1. Play to occupy and control the centre of the board. 2. Open with a central pawn, because this helps you to do just that. 3. Don't bring your queen out early. The queen can be driven back. 4. Develop knights before bishops, because, well, usually the knights are able to participate in the battle for the centre more quickly than the bishops. Move each piece once before you move them twice. This is a very general rule, but it will stand you in good stead. Castle early and beware the premature attack. 7 guiding principles to help you play the opening of a chess game much better. And now it's time to look at each of these in turn to see what they mean. Well, now let's move on to examining each of these principles in turn. And the first idea is that you should play to occupy or control the centre at the outset. Why is this so important? Because if you dominate the centre, you can get a grip on the game. A grip on the game means pressure on the opponent. And the more pressure you can put on the opponent, the better. Because it's likely that under pressure, any level of opponent is more likely to make a mistake. And once the mistake comes through, you take advantage of the mistake and hopefully go on to win the game. It all sounds easy, but well, it's perhaps not that easy in the hurly-burly of over-the-board play. But what I want to do now is to present you with a short game from an open tournament played in Uruguay in 1997, which will illustrate to you how important it is to control the centre at an early stage. What actually happens in this game is that black allows white free rein in the centre. He just allows him to dominate the whole central area of the board and quickly runs out of things to do. White is therefore able to mobilise his pieces as he sees fit and quickly wins with a crushing attack. What makes this game even more surprising from my point of view is that I actually know the black player, Herbert Perez Garcia, and he is a player of master standard. Quite what he was thinking on that particular day I do not know, but it just goes to show you even masters cannot break the rules at will in chess. They have to stick to the basics just like we do. Playing white in this game is Marcelo Lanzilotta, and white opens with a good first move, e4, one of the best. That's probably the most attacking move white can play because it sets the bishop free and the queen free. Also the knight has good perspectives. No other move allows so many pieces to come into the game as quickly, and as we can see, the white pawn is controlling the central squares d5 and f5, so a good move by white, and black responds likewise. White develops his knight. I'll talk a little bit later on about the speed and power of development, how to play a good development move, but take it from me, this is a good move because it immediately attacks the pawn on e5. And black decides to defend his pawn with knight c6. Another good move, in turn developing a piece, noting white's threat and controlling two central squares, e5 and d4. And now white thinks to himself, well, I really want to move this bishop on f1 because it helps me to castle next time, but I don't quite know where to put it. So how does white decide what the best square is for his bishop? Okay, now I'm going to give you a formula which will help you to make a good move every time with each specific piece, whichever piece you decide to move. It's a bit of a laborious idea at first, but once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. So much so that, you know, after a little while it's almost automatic to put a piece on a good square. What you do is simply count the number of squares a piece controls. Now and try and improve the position of that piece. Like for instance, the bishop on f1 is controlling 5 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very simple. If the bishop moves to e2, the bishop is now controlling the same 5 squares plus d1 and f3. So the count is 7. I'm not sure I like the bishop move to e2 that much because it blocks in the white queen, and we shouldn't really be blocking in any of our pieces in the opening if we can help it. But on the other hand, it's a very solid move, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just rather defensive. Most attacking players would prefer something a bit more aggressive. But bishop e2 is possible. Then we come to take a look at bishop d3. Well, on d3, once again the count is the same 5 as before, plus 6, 7. However, that's a move I don't like at all, because once again it's blocking in the white pieces. I begin to wonder how white is actually going to develop the queen side in this position, because, you know, white would very much like to be able to move this central pawn up the board in order to let the bishop on c1 out. I think this is the main crime of putting the bishop on d3 in this position. It makes no provision for the future. It's okay immediately, and it even defends the pawn on e4. But a few moves later, down the line, white is going to have problems with his bishop on c1. So it's not a very far-sighted move, bishop d3. It's a rather clumsy way to develop the bishop. This brings us to the game continuation, bishop c4. That's a very good move. It's an opening called the Italian game. It eyes black's weakest point in the opening, f7. And if we count the number of squares the bishop controls, well, the count is very high. We've got the original 5 squares. We've got a 6th square on b3, a 7th square on A2, 8, 9, 10 squares. So the bishop is very mobile and aggressive on C4. Going back to knight C6 for a final time, the only other reasonable move is bishop B5. And this is an opening called the Ruy Lopez. In fact, this is the Rolls Royce of chess openings. It's perhaps the most famous chess opening of all, and it's the move bishop B5 that a lot of grandmasters play when they come to this position. You might find this slightly surprising, as the bishop on B5 is only controlling 7 squares as opposed to 10 on C4, but the bishop is proceeding with threats. For instance, white might be threatening bishop takes knight, followed by knight takes e5. He may or may not be threatening that idea, but it's something that black has to worry about. So if we go back to knight c6 a final time, it seems a straight choice between playing bishop c4 for sheer aggression and mobility, or bishop b5 with mobility, a measure of control and a threat. And it's no secret that bishop c4 and bishop b5 are by far the most common moves in this position for white. The Italian game and the Ruy Lopez. Whichever you choose is a question of taste, but you can be guaranteed, if you use this square counting method, or as long as you note the opponent's threats, of almost always playing a good move. So anyway, that's one way to make a good move. On this day, Lanzillotta played bishop c4, and for the time being black proceeds with good moves, bishop c5. Again, just bringing out the bishop to the square where it controls most of the board. Now comes a good move, c3. White spies the possibility of playing d4, gaining space in the centre and time on the bishop. Black counters this with knight f6. He's trying to deal with white's aggression by making threats of his own. Black is actually attacking the pawn on e4. So we see this battle for the centre in full swing now, with white going straight through with d4. I mean, I think this is a good move here. If we look in the chess theory books, chess is a game with an enormous amount of literature on it, and a lot of this literature is devoted to opening systems, trying to find the best possible way to play in the opening phase. Well, it's obvious that d4 is a good move, but what happens next is perplexing for me. Black starts correctly by taking on d4, but then he plays a very passive move, bishop b6, and this is a move I don't like at all, because it leaves white in full command of the centre of the board. Now white has time to think about what he's going to do. He can think about reinforcing his centre by bringing the knight out. He can think about attacking either black knight with e5 or d5. It's an enviable choice for white. You know, it just seems to me that bishop b6 gives white a completely free hand. Look in those voluminous theory books and you will find the correct move, bishop b4, a move which doesn't waste any time. And after bishop d2, black can get a nice comfortable game by going bishop takes bishop check, getting rid of the potential liability, knight takes bishop, and now the important move, pawn up to d5, freeing up black's position, breaking up white's centre, and in general giving black a nice active game after e takes d5, knight takes d5. That would be a good classical way to play the black game. But after c takes d4, bishop b6, it's a different story now, with white in charge of the centre and thus gaining the advantage. And Lanzillotta moves in to take advantage of black's inaccuracy with the aggressive move e5. In general, if you are able to in chess, take the initiative as quickly as you can. Put the opponent on the back foot, make him think about defence if you can. This is a sure way to put pressure on the opponent and force that mistake. Well, Perez Garcia played his knight into e4, another move I don't like, but really what was the alternative? Is black really going to put his knight back on g8? I mean, that looks like a horrible move, undeveloping the pieces. And going back to e5, if black plays his knight to g4, well, white can continue to kick the black knight around, and not only does the knight drift to a poor square on the edge of the board, black is losing a lot of time as well. So, well, I think we can safely say black's probably gone wrong already. But knight e4 is another one of those horrible moves. The knight is unsupported in the middle of white's camp, and white moves in to take advantage of this feature of the position by playing queen e2, attacking the knight. And the knight finds itself without a great deal of support in this position. Now black is getting desperate. Despite the fact he's a master player, he understands that he is in really serious trouble. What he would like to do in this position is to support his knight by going d5, but then a capture en passant again puts black into serious trouble. Now the knight is pinned on e4 and cannot move. Well, black is probably losing this position. So if we go back to queen e2, Perez Garcia decided to surrender the knight with knight takes d4, but of course this can be no solution. Lanzillotta took on d4 and then took on e4, attacking the bishop on d4, so the bishop retreated, and now white just played a safety move, whisking his king to safety, castles on the king side. And already I think we can safely say that white has a winning position. He's got a safe king, he's material ahead, he's got the better position in the centre, and the pawn on e5 cramps black. So really, against any sort of player at all, black is completely lost. He tried castles. Now bishop d3 was a further excellent move. Checkmate is now threatened on h7. The queen and bishop form a battery. That means concentrated firepower against a weak point in the enemy camp. And black tries to break the threat of checkmate with f5. But again, this is a fairly hopeless move after e takes f6, when white renews his threat. Going back to bishop d3, I suppose g6 was the only other move, trying to blunt the white queen. Well, after that, bishop h6 is a very good move. Rook e8, what else? And now white just continues with development, threatening, for instance, knight into d5 and then knight into f6 check, which is a lethal attacking idea. So black is basically lost. He probably wants to get home as quickly as possible and get out of this horrible position, just end the game. White takes on f6 en passant, queen takes f6, the queen comes down and takes on h7 check, the king must run out to f7. Now white pauses to get the rest of his pieces into the attack with knight to c3, standard development. King goes to e8, absolutely horrible, and now white just brings his queen back to h5 check, after which black decided to resign. When you resign, that means the game ends, and the person who resigned actually loses. Why does black resign? Well, the problem is for black, he's got no moves at all. If he goes queen f7, he runs into bishop g6, pinning the queen to the king. Going back to the position after queen h5, it's exactly the same after rook f7. Bishop g6 just wins instantly. And if after queen h5 check, black decides to go king d8, bishop g5 again pins the queen to the king and wins the game instantly. So rather than see any of that on the board, Perez Garcia resigned. So summarising, why did black lose this game? Well, he didn't pay enough attention to the centre. He let white dominate the game from an early stage, and because of white's centre control, Lanzillotta was able to start a devastating attack from which black had no answer. I think when you are starting out in chess or trying to make a significant improvement in your play, it's very important to stick to the basics. Don't try anything fancy. It comes down to this principle of learning how to walk before you can run. And we come now to the second important principle of opening play: open with a central pawn. And that applies as much to black as it does to white. In general, I would recommend pushing one of your central pawns up at least one square, if not two squares in the opening, irrespective of what white does. And if you do so, you will always be able to count on at least a reasonable position. Now, in the game I'm about to show you, a game between two grandmasters, white gets very fancy in the opening and decides to play b3. Now, this is a reasonable opening. It's known as Larsen's opening, but it is not an opening for beginners. Playing white in this game is Yugoslav grandmaster Ljubomir Ljubojevic. He's an aggressive player, known for his fantastic imagination and willingness to experiment. And playing black is a guy called Lubos Kovalek, formerly from Czechoslovakia, national champion, grandmaster, again a player with tremendous imagination. Kovalek emigrated to the United States, where he became an extremely successful trainer of exceptionally strong chess players. Kovalek was known in the 80s and 90s as perhaps the most famous chess trainer in the world. And this game comes from the Manila tournament in 1973. Usually the best type of answer to a weird and wonderful opening like b3 is to react in the centre. And thus Kovalek plays the very sensible move e5. White brings his bishop to b2, trying to justify the opening by attacking black's pawn, and black defends with d6. So nothing fancy for black whatsoever. Black just gets a sturdy foothold in the centre and prepares to develop the rest of his pieces. As an alternative to d6, it's obvious that knight c6 is a reasonable move. I think Kovalek delays the development of his knight because he can see that white could possibly play a plan involving the development of the second bishop, and now white threatens bishop takes c6 followed by bishop takes e5. We'll see a bit later on that another principle worth employing for beginners is knights before bishops. And well, here it seems that Ljubojevic is determined to break most of the basic opening rules, and he gets punished as a result. I'm not saying that white's opening system is bad, not by any means, but it's just not a system for the average player to start out with. The positions reached are simply too difficult to handle for normal players. Just stick to the basics and you'll be okay. c4. Okay, this is a much better move by white. White is making an attempt to control the centre, in this case the d5 square. He's also preparing to bring his knight out to c3 behind the pawn, reinforcing that control of d5. Okay, g6. It costs a little bit of time to develop the bishop on f8 in this position when you play g6. Two moves. Going back, black could have developed this piece in one move by playing bishop e7. But Kovalek has obviously decided that e7 is not as active and aggressive as location for the bishop as g7 will be. So when black plays g6 in this position, he's basically saying he's going to play bishop g7 as quickly as possible. And strangely now, Ljubojevic decides to change approach. Sometimes you could do this with white, but well, d4, I'm not so sure about that move. When black takes, he brings the white queen into the game, and now black can start gaining time on the queen with knight c6. We will see a bit later on that it's quite unwise to bring your queen out too early in chess, because it exposes the queen and means that she can be easily attacked, as happens here. Again, Ljubojevic is playing with ideas. Grandmasters do not play random moves in the opening, they know what they're doing. And queen e3 check is the intention. White thinks he's actually disrupting black's natural development when he plays this move. But I'm very suspicious about white's opening play. The result of this game, the continuation, will just go to show you that even strong grandmasters cannot break the basic rules. There's something weird about the position of the white queen here, blocking in the king side. You begin to wonder how the bishop on f1 is going to get out. It's going to cost white quite a bit of time to get that bishop out. So basically, white is basing his whole opening play, it seems to me, on tricks. And this can never work against logical play in reply. And black is being very logical here. He blocks the check by developing a bishop. And, well, black's only two moves away from an extremely good position. If black could just play bishop g7 and castles, he's going to have an excellent game. with the white pieces on funny squares. So whatever white does, he's got to try and justify his formation. Let's see if Ljubojevic can do it. Okay, we can't argue with knight f3. Bishop g7. And now the knight comes to g5. Well, here's another rule being broken. Ljubojevic doesn't give two hoots about the idea that you shouldn't move any piece twice until you've moved every piece once. He comes in with a tricky attacking move. He's attacking the e6 bishop twice. He thinks, I'm going to win a pawn. But it turns out that Kovalek is willing to sacrifice that pawn with castles. And I think this is an excellent move. Knowing when to give up material in the opening is a really fine art. But in this particular position, black is banking on the fact that it's going to cost white a lot of time to take that bishop. And black is going to use the time he gains, with white grabbing hot pawns, to start a big attack. Now, just going back, of course, black didn't need to sacrifice the bishop, the pawn at all. He could simply have played his queen up to d7. But that's nowhere near as aggressive as the move that was played in the game. I think black's got a reasonable position after queen d7 too, but as I say, he decides to cast in the game. Alright, white takes the bishop on e6. Black recaptures. And now white plays g3. Again, a change of heart by white. White's whole opening play seems plagued with indecision. He can't quite make up his mind what he should be doing. Just going back one move, you begin to wonder why white doesn't take this pawn. He's basing his whole opening play on this pawn grab, and now he doesn't do it. Well, I think it's because he does actually believe in his position after that move. Obviously, black parks his king in the corner. Now white has some problems getting his pieces out. And one trick that he could possibly fall into is e3, knight d4. This is a very attractive stroke. It forks the queen and c2. Black is actually threatening knight c2 as well as the queen, forking the king and the rook. And if white takes this knight, then black has rook e8. We shouldn't be too surprised by this little combination. White is getting into trouble because he's breaking all the basic rules of opening play. So anyway, back at the game, Ljubojevic plays g3. And now black insists on gambit play by playing d5. If black had not been feeling so energetic, e5 is quite reasonable too, establishing a strong foothold in the centre and threatening a move like knight to g4. But going back to the game, d5 is very energetic, and finally white decides to bite the bullet and take on e6. Why does he do this? Well, I think basically because black's threatening pawn up to d4. It just shows you the advantage of putting pawns in the centre at an early stage. You can often push enemy pieces back and gain a bit of time for yourself. And the time that you gain will hopefully give you the attack. So in for a penny, in for a pound, white decides to take this pawn, and now black parks his king away. And it's quite an important idea in chess, you know, to have a safe king if you're going on to the attack, especially in a situation like this. So white is up a pawn. However, black's king is safe, white's queen is in jeopardy, and white is yet to complete his own development. So it is quite difficult, this position for white, whatever he plays. Ljubojevic played knight takes d5. Well, just to show you the difficulties that white is actually, you know, encountering here. If he plays bishop g2, then black plays knight d4, and this is an extremely embarrassing move for white to meet, attacking the queen, threatening knight c2 check, and that is graphically demonstrated by queen e3, knight c2 check, when no less than 3 white pieces are forked by the fantastically active black knight. If we go back to king h8, well, maybe white can try casting on the queen side. Again, this looks very precarious after a move like d4. I just don't like the black position, the white position here very much. Going back to king h8 one more time. If white tries to scurry away with his queen, then black has knight e4. And again, this is a very nasty forking move. the knight attacks f2, the knight attacks c3. If knight takes e4, then black comes down and takes on b2, and the white king is never going to escape out of the centre alive. Just to show you one cute plan here, rook b1, pawn takes e4, rook takes b2, and now queen f6, attacking both f2 and b2 and winning material. Okay, if you don't understand all these complex variations, all you have to know is that because white is breaking all the rules, he's getting into trouble. It really is as simple as that. It's child's play for a really strong player to take advantage of a guy who breaks all the rules, because they have a very sound position to move forward from, whereas the other guy is just clutching at straws, trying for tactical ideas. And that's the idea behind knight takes g5. White is hoping to bail out by exchanging off the fianchetto bishop on g7 and taking on d5. But all white succeeded in doing in this position is exchanging off all his developed pieces. Now white is left with a queen exposed in the middle of black's camp and not a single developed piece. He's also got his king stuck high and dry in the middle of the board. So now it's time to push white around. This is the strategy in such positions. When you've got the attack, be completely unrelenting. Do not waver, do not falter. Keep on hitting at the guy until he falls down. White moves his queen to g4. Black plays queen takes d5, not only regaining a pawn, but attacking the rook on g1. White has to block with this disgusting move f3, and now black moves him for the kill with knight e5. White tries a little trick, rook d1, but now knight takes f3 check reminds him who is boss in this position. The pawn on e2 is pinned against the king, and what is white to play here? He played king f2. I think Lebojevic had given up by this point. Obviously if he plays queen takes f3, we go queen takes f3, and white has just lost his queen for nothing. So king f2 was played, queen takes d1, e takes f3, queen d2 check, again hammering away. King has to go back to g1, comically blocking in the rook on h1, and now black moves him for the kill with rook e1. Super move. Queen c4, and now rook e8 joins up the dots. White decided to resign. He resigns because he doesn't have counterplay. If he goes queen takes c7 check, we just block with rook e7. And now white has to sit and watch as black systematically takes his king apart. So rather than see that, Lebojevic resigned. Now you may or may not have understood every single move in that game, but the overriding principles are clear. When you're starting out in chess, keep it simple. Open up with central pawns. They let the pieces free, they give you plenty of options, they keep your game solid and free from error. Don't break the rules until you understand the rules perfectly. And as this game showed, even grandmasters, when they break the rules, can look forward to severe punishment. Develop knights before bishops. Whilst this rule isn't always applicable, it's a good idea to keep it in mind when you're playing the opening, and particularly if you're a novice trying to improve at chess. The reason it's thought that the knight should come out before the bishop is that the knight can immediately participate in the battle for the centre, as we see here, and start making threats. Threats are basically an attack on the enemy position, which force he or she to think closely about what they're going to do. Creating threats is a step towards winning the game, as it starts to put pressure on the opponent, and it's only by putting pressure on your opponent that you're going to win. You can't rely on a mistake every single time. What you generally see in games between average players is that quite often the struggle is decided by a mistake. As you get stronger and stronger at chess, you have to try to outplay the opponent and force a mistake. This is not always easy to do, but creating threats is a good way to try to do this. And this is what developing the knight early gives you the opportunity to do. Now, I'll show you a game, a very brief game from the Bulgarian Under-20 Championships played in March 2009. It's by no means a great game, but it lends weight to the argument that the knight should come out before the bishops, because as you can see here, white is angling for a very solid opening setup, just bringing his knights out, in this case controlling the central square d5, and decides to answer this by moving a bishop. What I think black should do in this position is simply to copy white with knight to f6, bringing us to the 4 knights opening, although this isn't particularly exciting. Instead, bishop c5 gives white the opportunity to launch a tactical idea based on knight takes e5, and this is quite dangerous for black, as we'll see. Black captures the knight. Now he's a piece up temporarily, but white regains the knight and the piece by playing d4, after which 2 black pieces are attacked by a single white pawn. We call this a pawn fork. I think the main reason white has the advantage in this position is that it's much easier for him to develop his pieces than black. Black is a little bit cramped in this position, and particularly after bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and now pawn up to d6. We see that white's central pawn controls important central squares. White has complete freedom of movement, and he can continue to make threats with bishop f4. Now white is simply threatening to take this knight off on e5, winning a pawn. So by bringing his knights out early before his bishops, he was able to gain time, create threats, and now he's reaping the benefits of his earlier good moves. Well, black played queen to e7, a necessary defensive measure, but hardly very comfortable for black. Probably black would have preferred to have developed his bishop or his knight, but then he wouldn't have been attending to white's threat. The problem with queen e7 is that it walks straight into knight d5, and once again we see the benefit of developing that knight centrally earlier. The knight can come into d5. Now the knight is actually on the black queen. The queen has to move. Anyway, this position is already extremely strong for white, and in fact black is now about to make a losing mistake. I think he makes a losing mistake because he's completely fed up with what has actually taken place in this game. He's made what he thinks are reasonable moves, but in fact they've led him into a horrible position. Well, knight c6 can't be the answer. Black was hoping for counter-attack. I think if he'd gone queen to d8 here, which was probably his only move, then I think white can just settle for bishop takes knight. And after d takes e5, queen takes e5, black's already down to king f8. That's his only move, because both the king and the g7 pawn are attacked. And of course, after king f8, let's say castle's on the queen side, black has an absolutely horrible position. But it is infinitely preferable to the game, because after knight takes knight c6, queen e3, black is now getting into desperate trouble. He played queen e6. What a disastrous move. Knight takes c7 check, forking queen, rook and king. A 3-way fork, and black will lose his queen. Well, after this, the rest of the game isn't that interesting. White simply mops up. Black develops too little, too late, moves his king out of the fire of white's rook, but it really is child's play now to win from this position. In general, when you've got extra material, use it. That's the basic technique, and once white starts to use the queen in this position, black can have no possible defence. The queen is coming in, she's threatening g7. White is also threatening ideas such as e5. Black has absolutely no counterplay whatsoever. Knight e4 was the move that black played, and white moved in with the attractive checkmate queen e7. Okay, a very lightweight game, but the principle is clear. When you're starting out in chess or looking to improve, it's a good idea in the opening stages of the game to develop your knights before your bishops. Generally, this doesn't apply every single time, but for the most part, it's a very good idea. Move each piece once before you move any piece twice. This is on our list of priorities, but what does it actually mean? Well, I think I can simplify this rule for you. It basically means develop your pieces quickly. Only a few pawn moves, plenty of piece moves should be the mantra as you move out to the attack. Believe me, if you develop quickly, you control the centre and castle early, you will be able to get onto the attack quicker than you ever thought possible. As the defender, it's a very bad idea to go on a material hunt when you could be developing your pieces. So stick to the basics and you won't go far wrong. I've chosen a game for you here where the white player absolutely murders his opponent. His opponent breaks a lot of basic rules. He goes on a material hunt in the opening and neglects his development. And you can't do this against a player as strong as the player of the white pieces in this game, Mikhail Tal. Ex-world champion, one of the most wonderful attacking players in the history of the game, and he's playing a guy called Tringov, who is a grandmaster, but you wouldn't believe it when you see this game. Now, Tal opens with e4, which is probably the best move for beginners to play because it lets the pieces out in a straightforward fashion and occupies the centre. Black plays g6, which at the time this game was played in Amsterdam in 1964 was actually quite a popular defence. It's known as the modern defence. Black makes no effort to occupy the centre. Instead, he tries to bombard the centre from the wings with well-timed counter blows. Believe me, and I've played this opening a lot, this is not an opening for improvers or beginners. It's far too sophisticated and actually far too difficult. White is given free rein in the opening to develop his pieces and, well, also a free hand to occupy the centre. Please do not try this at home on your own. It is not a good idea. And to play this line against Tal, I think, is folly, because Tal understands that straightforward play is the order of the day against an opening like this. Black's opening is very cagey. It's reactive. He's waiting to see what White's doing, then he's going to take some action. Well, Tal answers this in very straightforward fashion. He simply gets his pieces out and he develops them as quickly as he can to aggressive squares. So the white pieces are streaming out. Meanwhile, Black's next move is a step in the wrong direction. He's bringing his queen out early. Yes, he spies there's a possible weak point in the white camp, but this is a most foolhardy pawn hunt to go on against an attacking genius like Tal, because of course Tal is very willing to sacrifice this pawn in order to speed up his development. So yet another white piece comes out. I mean, the novice might think, oh, I'm going to lose a pawn here, and play a passive move like rook b1, or maybe going back even queen c1. Either of these moves is far too passive an approach to the situation. White has faith in his position, he backs his good development, and he actually invites Black to take the pawn, which, well, Tringov felt he probably had to do. He's got to try and justify that move queen b6 somehow, and he snatches this pawn. But of course it's a very risky procedure, as firstly White gets the chance to develop his rook actively, free of charge more or less. The queen goes to a3, and then White's bishop streams out. So as you can see, White's developing all his pieces very quickly. Black brought his queen back to a5, no doubt fearing that the queen might get trapped down there on a3, and White castled. So what a glorious advert for development the White position is. He's got every piece in play. Meanwhile, Black is a pawn up, but I think he's going to die with his belly full in this game. It remains for White to find the most efficient way to start direct attack. Well, Black tries to shut this bishop down on c4. This is a common tactic for the defender to close a diagonal. Tal is quite unconcerned. He plays the unhurried move rook fe1. So if there was ever a game which highlights the idea of moving each piece once before you move a piece twice, this must be the game, because White's moved every single piece once and he's got a glorious position. But of course that glorious position can go away if Tal doesn't find the best way to open things up. So that's White's next task. How does he open this game up? Well, Black played a6. I think Black in this game was being far too provocative. Having said that, I'm not actually sure what black should play. I think black is probably in trouble already. It remains for white to find the correct opening up move in the centre, either with e5 or d5. a6 is very, very slow. White latches onto the weakness very quickly, and black decides to play e5, and this probably is the decisive mistake. Black should almost certainly try to keep things tight by playing queen to c7, but even then I think white gets on with his business of opening up the game with e5, and then if d5, white has the interesting sacrificial move here, bishop takes d5, with the point that if black captures with the c pawn, white is going in with all guns blazing. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now e6, after which black has every chance of being murdered in his bed. In fact, well, what does black do here? The queen is under attack. If he goes queen d8, white continues to rip open the king with e takes f7 check, and actually black is not long for this world in this position. So going back to bishop f4, that's why black is trying to block the idea of e5 out of the game, but he's just inviting all the white pieces to the party after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now the brilliant move, queen to d6. This is an extremely strong continuation. The point of it, well, in the game, black played queen takes knight. The main point of it is that if black takes the bishop on f4, which at first sight seems extremely plausible, then white has the beautiful move knight d5. And if pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, discovered check. Bishop e6 is the only move. Pawn takes e6. f6, what else? Black is trying to block, but it's far too late. And now rook takes b7. Just strips the black king completely apart. So in the game, going back to queen d6, black played queen takes c3. Then came rook fd1, which threatens checkmate on d8. Black blocks with his knight. Bishop takes f7 check, another not so surprising sacrifice to the master eye, because the master sees all these black pieces on the back rank, and he just knows that black will have no defence to the onslaught of the perfectly developed white army. Queen e6 check, and Tringoff decided to totter out of the tournament hall at this point, having had quite enough of the battering. There are two nice variations. If black goes knight e7, white has the cute queen f7 check, king d8, and now the superb checkmate with the knight. Knight e6, I think we'd be very proud to pull off a checkmate like that ourselves. Meanwhile, going back, if king to d8, knight to f7 check, king c7, and now once again a beautiful checkmate with queen d6 check. And this game looks for all the world like something out of the 19th century, where Paul Morphy or some other attacking genius was playing the white pieces. But in fact it was a game grounded solely in logic. White's lead in development became overwhelming, and Tal knew that he had to sound the attack. If he had to sacrifice, so be it. The final position once again tells a story. It's difficult to imagine in the final position that black is actually two pieces up. He is, but in dynamic terms he's about three pieces down, because they're all sitting on the back row doing nothing. The moral of the story, even if you don't understand every single move in this game, get your pieces out in chess. It really does matter, and as quickly as possible. Castle early. Get the king to safety. This is a golden rule of chess, which every player at any level has to bear in mind. Leave the sophisticated attacks, the unusual play, the unorthodox opening variations to the very strong player. If you're just starting out in chess or you're trying to improve, your most important piece is your king, and it's your responsibility to get the king to safety as quickly as you can, as early as you can. This generally means castling. The graveyards, the chess graveyards, are littered with the corpses of players who left their king in the middle and got murdered as a result. Now, there are literally tens of thousands of games along these lines, and the lower level you go, the more of these games apply. But there's nothing magical about this rule at all. You've simply got to look after your king in chess. If you don't, you are going to pay a heavy price. And I'm going to show you a very old game. In the 19th century, romantic play was the order of the day. Swashbuckling attacks, gambits, people were willing to sacrifice material in order to try to get the attack. Well, in that era, some very attractive games were played simply because defensive technique was not as strong as it is today. Well, nowhere near as strong. And this game comes from 1864 between Adolf Anderssen, who was actually one of the strongest players of the 19th century, and he's playing a guy called Emil Schalop, who is also a very strong player, or was at that time, but this is certainly a game he would like to forget. White's opening, the King's Gambit, the darling of the Romantics, a ferocious attacking opening, very risky because White's opening up his King's side. On the other hand, the rewards are high for the daring attacking player in the King's Gambit. Even today, it's an opening well worth playing, and especially for players who are trying to improve, because it teaches you the art of attack. If White doesn't attack using the King's Gambit, he generally ends up losing because he's already compromised his position to an extent. Anyway, in this game, Black plays a counter gambit, d5. Not a bad move, opening up lines for all his pieces. And White decides to play knight f3. That is an old-fashioned response to d5, which is known as the fork-beer counter gambit. In general, White takes on d5 in this position, and Black will push. And Black's idea is that pawn creates a wedge in the White position, making it actually quite difficult for White to develop his pieces to their ideal squares. Okay, White is perfectly alright in this variation, but this is no place to get involved in King's Gambit theory. Suffice it to say that after knight f3, Black should get a reasonable position by taking on e4. White takes on e5, and Black plays bishop d6. This is not exactly the normal King's Gambit fare, but again, I should say it looks okay for Black for the time being. Bishop c4. White is first to create direct threats. In this case, the pawn at f7. Black takes on e5. Already a slight concession. I'm not overly happy about that move. Probably Black should have played knight h6, which defends the pawn on f7 and prepares to castle, getting his king to safety. The knight goes to the edge of the board, not an ideal post, but nevertheless Black defends against the threat. If we go back to the game, bishop takes knight is quite a big concession. But Black had this idea that he was going to win a pawn with queen to d4. A greedy move. Black is breaking the rules. He's developing his queen early and he's pawn grabbing. This is not a good idea in chess, to go on a pawn hunt in the opening when you are in fact neglecting your development. Yes, it's true, Black wins a pawn. Queen takes e5. But the problem for Black is he's losing time, and White is going to use that time to open up the position. So with all guns blazing, Anderssen plays d4, and the point of that move is clear. When Black takes the pawn with queen takes d4, White is just going to carry on developing as quickly as he can and leaves the Black queen sitting there in the middle of the board. Well, 2 pawns up for Black, but can he survive? Knight f6. Okay, Black is going to castle, it seems to me. Bishop e3. No, I'm afraid you're not going to castle, because I'm going to attack your queen relentlessly to stop you from castling. Black went all the way back to d8, and now Black castles. Well, I guarantee you, if you show this position to virtually any master player and ask them to assess it, they would probably say that Black is almost lost. Why is this? Because his development is so retarded here. You know, Black's way behind in development. and king is still in the middle. Shallop plays h6. Of course, what he's afraid of is that if he castles in this position, white is going to play rook a d1, black will play queen e7. Now white will play some horrific move like bishop g5, pinning the knight. The pin on the knight is what black is afraid of. But even here, in this position, it may well be that black can survive with a move like queen c5 check. That forks king and bishop, so probably white would have to retreat and start again after queen e7. But I have no doubt at all that white has many promising attacking continuations in this position. Who knows, maybe even rook takes f6 is a good move here. It's easy to get away with this type of effect when the enemy has only got a queen developed and nothing else in play. But h6, going back to the game, is simply catastrophic. It's an unnecessary move at this stage, and black really isn't dealing with the top priority here, which is his king stuck in the middle. So it's not really surprising that white moves in for the kill here with bishop c5, which is an excellent move, preventing black from castling. Black tries to drive the bishop away with knight bd7, and now white plays a beautiful move to finish off. Queen takes e4 check. A shell-shocked Shallop resigned. Why does he resign? Well, if he blocks with the queen, we just take it, checkmate. If he takes the queen, white has the equally beautiful bishop takes f7 check, which to the beginner or novice might seem like a magical continuation, almost artistic. White sacrifices his queen and then finishes off with a lovely checkmate. We would all like to play like this, but in fact it's a checkmate grounded on logic. Black broke the rules, he grabbed hot pawns, he kept his king in the middle, and he was completely wiped out as a result. The moral of this story is clear. Get your king to safety as early as you can in chess. Then you will have plenty of plans to choose from. If you leave your king in the middle, you're running a grave risk of being wiped out. My next example is very brief indeed, but it will highlight why you should not bring your queen out early in the opening phase of the game, unless there are exceptional circumstances. The logic is that the queen is your most powerful piece, so she is best kept in reserve until the lesser pieces have been developed and all the pieces can work together. In general, the queen doesn't really operate very well on her own in the opening phase of the game, because she can be easily attacked and driven back and you lose time. Now, the game I'm going to show you, as I say, is very brief indeed. It's from an email tournament, a correspondence chess tournament, played in 2001. Playing white is an unfortunate fellow called Holger Thorsten Kraft, and playing black is a guy called Peter Leiserbahn. Now, the opening phase of the game is very poor from white's point of view, because he comes out with the move queen f3. This can only be a very bad move. It's a bad move for several reasons. One, the queen is a target for black's pieces, if not immediately, then very soon. Two, you're blocking in your knight on g1. That's the problem. The minor pieces should come first. Get your king to safety. Only then think about the queen and rooks. Here, the development of the queen is premature. White is obviously basing his play on a very crude trap. You see this idea a lot in games between beginners. They understand that f7 is the weakest square on the board and they go for the quick kill. But of course, anybody decent is just going to block your threat. And, well, after that, what is left? The problem is white hasn't got a backup plan to this immediate attack. And without a backup plan, all that's going to happen is the queen will be attacked, as here, with knight d4. A very good move, a fork, attacking the queen and the pawn at c2. White went queen d3, which is again a very clumsy move. White doesn't seem to understand that that move, although it defends c2, blocks in the queen side. I mean, much better was queen d1, but then of course you have to be fairly flexible to play such a move. You have to be able to admit that your move queen f3 on the second turn was rubbish, and you're trying to undo the damage. But queen d3 just makes things worse. And perhaps this highlights another important opening principle: don't block in your pieces if you can help it. Well, black finds just a simple counter. Usually the simple counter is best to these weird and wonderful ideas. With c6, black is simply intending to expand in the centre with d5 and attack the bishop. And the bishop will be driven back, therefore black will gain time. Out came white's knight. Up came the pawn to d5. White perhaps took on d5 suspecting nothing, but he was struck down with bishop f5. And now really that, to all intents and purposes, is already the end of the game. Why? Because the queen's attacked. The pawn on c2 beyond is attacked. White played the really horrendous move, queen takes d4. The only other square for the queen worth consideration is f1. Well, then of course black just goes in with the knight. Takes the rook with a completely winning position. But queen takes d4 hastens the end. E takes d4, knight takes d4, e takes d5, c takes d5, and white resigned. Now, of course, the quality of that game was very poor, but all of the poor moves were played by white. Black did nothing apart from play simple chess. He reacted to white's premature queen excursion with simple development. He blocked the immediate threats, and then he was able to start a counter-attack with knight d4 as a result of the poor position of the white queen. The moral of the story is clear. Unless very unusual circumstances apply, don't bring your queen out early. She comes out a bit later after the rest of the pieces have been developed. All the guiding principles we've discussed so far are based on sound common sense. They're designed to teach the student that it's a very bad idea to break the rules before you actually have mastered the rules. Don't run before you can walk. And my final guiding principle that I like to discuss is the idea of the premature attack. A lot of beginners become carried away with their own improvement and they think they can launch any sort of attack from any position, any time. Well, against a skilled opponent, especially if that opponent is developing in a normal way, a basic way, without error, there's no foundation for any sort of premature attack. So beware the premature attack in chess. Stick to the solid principles of getting all your pieces out, castling, playing to control or occupy the centre. Only when you've got your pieces out and you have attained a state of full development should you be thinking about the attack. Now, just to illustrate a premature attack and how it might rebound, in this case catastrophically, on the guy who is launching it, I'll show you a game from the Alushta tournament played in September 2008 between a chap called Alexander Chernukov and an international master called Timofey Ilyin. The opening is fairly standard, both sides developing their pieces in apple pie order. This is the Italian game, and black plays the two knights defence. Now white plays a very controversial move, knight to g5. Yes, it's true, white is creating what looks like a game-winning threat. Knight takes f7. However, I think this is a variation that the beginner or improver should avoid like the plague, because it's very risky, and once again it confronts our understanding of the basic rules. White is moving his knight for a second time. He's making it difficult for black, yes it's true, but if black manages to defend himself, then I wonder whether the time lost with knight g5 is going to rebound on white. Now in this game, black played a very surprising move, which actually looks like a mistake, but this is a famous variation called the Wilkes Barre. Black offers vast amounts of material in order to get onto the attack, and he actually encourages white to play knight takes f7, which is what Chernukov did in this game. Now if you don't like this particular white knuckle ride, I'll just take you back to knight g5 and make the point that black has a perfectly decent alternative here in the blocking move d5. Curiously, newcomers to chess often overlook blocking moves, and especially when they're in check they think they have to move the king or something like that, The blocking move is by far the most effective way to deal with most threats. So watch out for blocking moves in your games. However, in this game, bishop c5 is a rather madcap variation, and the idea is that when white goes on this material hunt with knight takes f7, which by the way is the third time he's moved this knight in the opening, black goes in with all guns blazing, bishop takes f2 check, which is the point of the whole variation. Now, king takes f2 was played in this game, so this is going to be obviously the acid test of what black is doing. White grabs the material and hopes that he's going to survive the onslaught after knight takes e4 check. White went king e3, and now black brought his queen out to h4, inviting white to grab the rook in the corner, which in this particular game is exactly what white did. Now, if there was ever a premier attack launched by white, this is the one. The knight on h8 has moved no less than 4 times to get to h8. White has neglected his development. Yes, black has had to sacrifice a piece, but the white is driven out into the open, and to take the rook on 8 in this position is simply folly. Just going back one move, black has to take his chances in the position after g3, knight takes g3, h takes g3, queen d4 check, king f3. But I think black's got every chance of finishing white off in this position after the move d5. The point is that material is less important than development in the opening of a game of chess, and this is a classic case. White can win vast amounts of material, but look at the position of his king. Look at the threats black is generating. Black is already threatening pawn takes bishop. He's threatening bishop g4 check, winning the queen. I would not like to be white in this position. But in the game, black makes white regret this rook capture. Queen f4 check is played. King goes to d3. Knight comes into f4 check. King goes to c3. Queen goes to d4 check. This is absolute misery for white because his moves are all forced. King goes to b3, and now there are 2 ways to win. In the game, black chose queen b6 check, king c3, and now queen to b4 checkmate. If we go back to queen b6 check, if bishop b5, black simply takes it, king a3, and now white gets checkmated in another horrific way. Well, horrific if you're white. If you're black, this is absolute paradise, of course. But the least said about white's play in this game, the better. Now, why did white lose? Well, I'm going to say something about it because I found this game amazing when I first saw it. First of all, white was very greedy. Secondly, white launched a premature attack and went on a material hunt, neglecting his development. This allowed black to launch a counter-attack due to the fact that black had already the better development after bishop c5, and white crashed to a horrific defeat. And the final position tells a story. 5 white pieces on the back rank undeveloped, a knight stranded on h8 at the other end of the board, and the king mated embarrassingly on a3. Don't let this happen to you. Don't launch premature attacks. Don't go on to the attack until you have your development completed. I think this suggestion is going to stand you in very good stead. I'm now going to move on to discuss the 4 basic elements that make up chess as a dynamic game. The first element that's very important is time. Then we have space. The third element that has to be given close consideration is force or material. And the final element, which we have to consider at virtually every stage of a chess game, is pawn structure. So that's time, force, space and pawn structure. And I'm going to attempt to define these terms a bit more closely now. And the first term I'm going to look at is the idea of time in a chess game. Now, it's obvious in chess that time, basically the unit of the move, is of crucial importance. If you waste your move, or you play a move which is inaccurate, you are going to be losing time. Lots of games are lost as a result of one player understanding the notion of time within a game and the other player completely failing to come to terms with it. We see time when we consider basic principles. For instance, we've already discussed the idea of developing quickly, not moving a piece twice until you've moved every piece once. Well, all this is connected with time. Time essentially is all about mobility, development and striking whilst the iron is hot. You can see it all the time if you look at chess games. One symptom of lost time in a game, for instance, will be a cramped position or a neglect of development. So, how can I put it? Time is basically equivalent to something like the serve in tennis. You know, unless you follow up your time advantage vigorously, it's likely to dissipate. The driving force or the initiative in a game of chess is of crucial importance. Now, I'm going to show you a game here where White understands the notion of time very well. It's a game from a correspondence tournament played in 1997. Playing White is a fellow called Jose Antonio Barrios Troncoso, very long and unwieldy name. Playing Black is a German guy called Werner Nietzsche, and I imagine these two fellows were of correspondence master standard because they're both rated over 2400, which on the international scale is very high indeed. Well, White kicks off by playing a gambit, the Danish gambit. Essentially, White is offering Black material in the opening in order to gain time. That's what it's all about. Whilst Black is grabbing pawns, White is developing pieces. Now, whether this is sound or not is hardly the question. It's actually quite difficult to meet over the board. Black must be very precise in defence. White has launched a gambit. Now, there are basically three ways to meet a gambit. The first way, the cowardly way, is to decline the gambit. Well, I say cowardly, but sometimes, you know, it's the wisest course of action. The second way is to take everything on offer and try to keep the gambit material that you've won, gradually sap the attack and win in the endgame. This is by far the most difficult way to play against gambits because it requires prolonged defence usually, and you're going to have to make up a significant time deficit, which is not at all easy. And the third way, of course, is the way often employed by masters, to accept the gambit in one form or another and then to return the material at a favourable moment in order perhaps to gain back time or simply to get a good position. Now, in this game, Black has obviously taken all the pawns, but now decides to employ method 3, giving back a pawn in order to drag the white bishop into an exposed position on d5 and speed up Black's development. So Black is gaining back a little bit of time with this move, bishop b4 check. White brings his knight out to c3. Nietzsche snaps off the knight, which is slightly unusual in that it gives White a very powerful bishop on c3, but Black intends to play knight f6 in this position, blocking the bishop's diagonal and gaining time on the bishop at d5. It seems at the outset as though White hasn't really got enough for his pawn. Black has adopted a very sensible way of meeting this fiery gambit. He has given back a pawn, he's still a pawn up, and he's blunting White's initiative by attacking the exposed bishop on d5, thus gaining back the time he lost when he was grabbing all those hot pawns. Well, okay, White still has some compensation. His compensation can be seen in easy moves such as queen f3. It's easy for White to continue developing his pieces, but for the time being as Black, I would be rather happy. I get to castle. I seem to have no weaknesses. Admittedly, White has an extremely strong bishop on c3, but that's what looks like his only compensation for the pawn. And so, I think Black should be reasonably happy with this position. However, I invite you to see what happens in the game. White plays knight e2, Black plays knight d7, and now White castles. That's absolutely essential. And Black moves to attack the pawn on d5. I'm not at all sure whether that was the world's greatest move, because the action is going to take place on the king side in this position. we can see that the white pieces are converging on the black king side. White's only a few short moves away from being able to put significant pressure against the g7 square close to the black king. And so I'm not at all sure that knight b6 is the right move in this position. I think black played knight f6 here, waiving the double pawns that occur after bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, g takes f6. Black is still a pawn up. Admittedly, black's pawns on the king side are isolated and doubled, but white's pawn on d5 is also weak. I think this would have been a safe way for black to play. It swaps off a lot of the potential attacking pieces that white has, and regains all the time lost in the opening. My assessment of this position is slightly better for black because of the extra pawn. But black maybe saw this variation and thought to himself, well, that's not enough. I might not be able to win that position, whereas after knight b6 I'm attacking d5, and it's up to white to show me what compensation he's got. Well, white played rook d1. White has two main hopes in this position. Number one, it's easier for him to develop his rooks. Black's still got to move this bishop out to a good square in order to get the rook on a8 into the game. He's also got to move his queen, so that's two full moves before black can get that rook on a8 into the game. Meanwhile, white develops his own queen's rook immediately. The pawn on d5 cramps black a little bit, so maybe it's not so easy for black after all. It looks as though it should be easy, but well, judge for yourselves. Black plays queen g5. His idea behind that is that he wants to play bishop g4 when white has several pieces on the same diagonal as black's bishop. So white moves to stop that with rook d4. Black moves his bishop out modestly to d7, and now white plays knight g3. Again, it's not totally obvious where white's compensation is coming from in this position, but white is about to gain time on the black queen with ideas such as h4, and who knows, that pawn might advance all the way up the board to h6, softening up the black king. Of course, a move like h4 is time gaining, and thus black loses time by having to go backwards, and he loses a further move with the pawn advancing up to h5. In general in chess, time is gained by making threats, and so white's next move, rook f4, is also a very good move because it gains time with a threat. Black plays knight takes d5, seemingly ignoring the threat, and white goes straight in with rook takes f7. So white is now attacking both g7 and d7. Bishop g4, hoping to regain time. Time is basically an attack on an enemy piece. You are hoping to get back some time with bishop g4, but let's see what happens. Rook takes g7 check. In the light of this move, I just want to play back a couple of moves to rook takes f7. And you might have wondered why black didn't play knight takes c3 in this position. Well, I think after that, white goes rook takes f7. And now white has two threats. He threatens the knight, and he threatens the very strong move queen f7 check. So I'm not sure whether black is able to beat back both those ideas by virtue of a single move. So that's why he went bishop g4. Anyway, rook takes g7 check happened. Queen takes g7. If white takes the black queen, black will respond likewise. So white takes on d5. Bishop comes back to e6. And now white puts his queen on c5. Black plays b6. And white plays queen to e3. Now, if we count in the material in this position, we can quickly see that black is the exchange up. He's got a rook and white has only got a knight. In order to compensate for that, white is hoping to put his queen on the long diagonal. He either wants to put it on d4 or e5. And the point of this is to zoom down the diagonal to create pressure or possibly even checkmate on g7 or h8. So black has got to be extremely careful what he does, and in the game Nietzsche decided to try to return material by bishop d5. But white was having none of it. He continues to manoeuvre. He hits the black queen, drives her back, and then positions his queen on the diagonal. Now in this position, because this was a correspondence game, and because players have a lot of time to consider their moves, actually as soon as white got his queen on that diagonal, black resigned. Now you might not resign this position, and I might not resign it. Over the board, I would want to see what white would play against king f7 in this position. I think that's the only decent move for black. Well, it can be shown that white wins this position by direct attack. Let me show you how. He goes queen g7 check, king e6. All the time this is forcing play. Black is being forced to do what he doesn't want to do every single move. King goes to f7. Queen comes into f5 check. Incidentally, if you were wondering why black doesn't go king d7 in this position, it's because he just simply loses the bishop on d5 with check. Gain of time again. So back to the game, queen e5, king f7 was played. Queen f5, now we see coordination between the white pieces. The queen and bishop are doing separate jobs. King goes back to g8. Queen g4, it might seem as though white is making no progress whatsoever. But now the winning move, rook d1, pinning the bishop on d5 against the queen. If rook g8 in this position, queen f5 check. And that's why black resigned. He can't stop white taking all his pieces in this position. If he moves his king, well, if he goes to e7, white has the devastating move bishop f6 check. Meanwhile, if he goes king e8, well, white doesn't even have to take the bishop in this position. Stronger by far is rook e1 check, after which black loses all his pieces. So that whole game really was about time. Time won, time lost. You have to keep in mind the element of time at all stages throughout a chess game. Don't lag behind. Don't make meaningless moves. Make sure each of your moves has a point. If you do so, it's likely that you will win more games. The third basic element of chess is force. If I draw an analogy between two human beings who are fighting, usually the stronger player will win. And so it is on the chessboard. The player who attacks with more force or has, for instance, material superiority usually has by far the better chance to win the game. The basic principle of force in chess is that material superiority is decisive when all other things are equal. Once you win material, the general idea is to simplify as much as possible, keep exchanging and steer for the endgame. In the endgame, the process of converting force into victory becomes easier because the opponent has less chance to confuse the issue when there are only a few pieces on the board. Now I'm going to show you a game here, again from a high level of chess, where white loses a pawn in the opening, perhaps he gives it up, and black shows excellent technique, going on to win the game in what looks like an effortless manner. This is a pure expression of force on the chessboard. The guy relinquishes force by giving up the pawn. The other guy takes over the game and wins. This is the game Johnny Hector, Grandmaster from Sweden, playing white, and G. Gorgiadze playing black. And this game was played in Spain in 1995. The opening is the King's Gambit. Swashbuckling opening. This is no place to go in for a debate on the merits of this opening. Black plays bishop c5, which is a solid move. The King's Gambit declined. White brings his knight out to f3, and black pushes the pawn up to d6. White goes c3, and now an interesting little finesse by black, bishop b6, stepping out of white's intended advance in the centre with d4. I think black's idea is that when white plays d4, he's going to take on d4 and then play bishop g4 when pressure starts to mount against d4. But as I say, this is no place to discuss opening ramifications. Instead, Hector played knight a3, and the point of this is he wants to play knight c4 as quickly as he can and nab the two bishops. Alright, black plays knight f6, f takes e5, d takes e5, knight c4, and now black takes a pawn on e4. Okay, white can get this pawn back by taking off the bishop and going queen e2. Now there are two black pieces on the e-file, but black is able to speed up his development, give back the pawn in relatively favourable circumstances by playing knight c5, exchanging off the queens, and in this position black should have a comfortable game from the opening. Okay, black's king looks to be in a slightly odd position, but the problem for white here is that A, d3 is under fire, and 2, white is behind in development. Now white tries to address the problem of his retarded development by playing bishop f4, and black plays rook e8. And now in true Hector style, because Hector is a very aggressive player, he's also willing to sacrifice if need be, Hector played knight h4. Personally, I don't think much of that move. As you'll see, black is able to win a pawn in comfort in this position. But white's idea is that when black goes bishop takes d3, as Giorgadze did, he was going to castle on the queen side, gaining time on the bishop. Of course, this is a speculative adventure by white. He's trying to gain time so that he can get the attack against black's king. Going back to the position after rook e8, I think actually white should just simply step away with king f2 and take his chances in this position. I think this would probably have been a better bet, and the idea is if black takes on d3 with the bishop here, well, white can think about playing rook e8 check, rook e1 check, king d7, rook takes rook, king takes rook, bishop takes c7. And if white wasn't happy with that particular continuation after bishop takes d3, well, he could just take on c7 right away. However, going back to the game, after knight h4, as I say, black is able to grab this pawn, and really over the course of the next few moves, white is unable to gain any compensation for it. Well, Hector was in a very aggressive mood. He played bishop c4. He maybe wants to play his last piece into the game to e1 to pin the bishop on e4. What he should have perhaps tried was bishop takes c7. Admittedly, black can take on a2 in this position and remain a pawn up, but after bishop d6, white has some chance to confuse the issue. After bishop c4, however, black played b5, and after bishop d5, black took on d5 and played knight e6, a very careful move, both protecting the pawn on c7 and attacking black's bishop on f4. White tried knight f5 check, but if black can weather this immediate storm, there's every chance he's going to end up a pawn up for nothing. Okay, well now, if white takes on b5 here, I think black can take on a2, and of course white can't take on b7 here because of rook a1 check, king d2, king c2, and now rook takes h1. So going back to rook takes b5, rook takes a2, I think probably white will have to play a move like king c2 in this position, and now black has several moves. One interesting move is g6 in this position, and if the white knight moves away, black has tactics based on knight ed4 check. Going back to the position after king c2, there's a safe move available as well after rook a7. Perhaps that's the best move of all, and on bishop f2 we just go b6. By these means black happily consolidates his position. Going back to the game then, and knight c6, white tried a3, but after b4, c takes b4, black had now the excellent move knight takes b4, and the main point is that if white takes this knight, the rook comes down the back, checking, skewering the king to the rook on h1. So after knight takes b4, white has to continue with as active a move as he can find, rook d7, and black just now plays knight c6. White brought his rook to d1, rook e d8, rook takes d8 check, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, knight c takes d8, and basically over the last few moves black is gradually starting to convert his advantage in force. He's now a good pawn up, and he should go on to win this endgame. Now, it's easy to say the rest is a matter of technique. Well, let's see how black systematically converts his extra pawn into victory. The first question we must ask ourselves is, where is black's extra pawn? Okay, well, it's actually on the king side. Black has 3 pawns to 2. So what we're looking for black to do is to exchange off the king side pawns to leave the situation where black has 1 king side pawn, we call that a pass pawn, and white has no pawns at all. The idea is that the pass pawn ties the enemy down. We'll learn a little bit about this in our endgame DVD. But with white completely tied down to defending against the pass pawn, the idea is this frees black up on the other side, and he can make a decisive infiltration over perhaps on the queen side. The problem for white here is that he is defending. No matter how hard he tries to create counterplay, black, by just pushing his king side pawns, can keep white on the defensive, and it really is child's play for black to continue to systematically improve his position. The king is a strong piece in the endgame, so black happily brings up his king. He pushes the king side pawns, all the time thinking about creating a pass pawn, and white really has no defence. The black king is infiltrating, the pawns advance. White moves around trying to find tricks, but there are no tricks to be found. The black king is impregnable on f5. Okay, knight a5. Knight e5 check. At least white was attacking the pawn on b7 there. King c3, but now comes b5. White played b3. I think white's hoping to create an outside pass pawn of his own on the a file, after which perhaps black will be tied up. But black's centralisation and overall firepower in the middle of the board is so strong that white really can't do this with any hope of success. Alright, pawn comes up to a5. The pawn goes to b4 check. A nice little trick, because if king takes b4, black has knight d3 check, and white will lose his bishop. So king comes to d2, c5, a6. Black easily stops the advance of white's pawn, and now after g3, black finally creates that passed pawn on f3. This is the pawn really that's going to win the game. This is the pawn that completely ties white up. So white tries to isolate that pawn with the hope of winning it. h6, bishop e3, knight a7. Both sides are manoeuvring, but black has the upper hand. Knight comes to b5. Pawn goes up to h4. G takes h4. Bishop takes h6. And now knight bd4. This was the problem for white in taking on f3 earlier. The knight will come to d4. And the pawn at b3 would drop. Essentially, the pawn on f3 is tying white up completely. And now black adds a second string to his bow, the pawn on h3. King g3, knight f5 check. King takes f3. Another nice trick, knight f4, so that if king takes f4, black queens a pawn in broad daylight. That should be enough. So white tried knight d8 check. King b6. King takes f4, of course it's all over now. King takes f5. h1 equals queen. Knight e6. Now there's a massive advantage in force for black. It's just a question of how black finishes the job. Usually the queen is far more powerful than knight and bishop. Of course what white's hoping for is that the black king's not playing here. But after queen e4 check, king d6, queen d3 check, king e7, queen e3 check. Black's just trying to force an opening here. The knight moves, king b6, bishop f8, queen takes b3. Two passed pawns to contend with. Knight c5 check, and rather than play on in this position, white decided to resign. Perhaps the simplest winning move in this position is queen g3 check. White's got to maintain contact with the knight, and now black mops up with an easy win. Let's say king c4, well, queen f4 check, something like this. Just to summarise, force is a most important element of chess. It's generally attached to the material balance. If you're ahead in material, you have an advantage in force. Use that advantage. The most efficient way is to swap off to a winning endgame when your advantage in force usually tells in the most in the easiest possible way. After time, we now turn to the idea of space in chess. And space basically means how much of the board do you control. It's often the case that the player with an advantage in space, the person who controls more territory on the chessboard, has more freedom of movement for his pieces. The principle is that if you have freedom of movement for your pieces, it makes it that much easier to build up an attack or develop the initiative. You generally have more choice of plans due to your increased control of space, and this helps you to force a mistake, create pressure, and go on to win the game as a result. Now we're going to see on another DVD in this series that cramped positions need not necessarily be fatal as long as you've got the right pieces in the right places at the right time. But it's far easier to have more space and thus more choice of plans. This gives you increased options and makes your task in finding a good move, let's say, more simple. I'm going to show you a game from Tilburg, a famous tournament which was played in Holland during the 1990s between two grandmasters. Leonid Yudashin, grandmaster now living in Israel, playing white, and he's playing Yevgeny Vladimirov, a Russian grandmaster, graded 2580. And in this game, white quickly builds up an advantage in space. The opening is the French defence, and this is a tough and robust opening for black, but quite often in the French, black is forced to cede an advantage in space in the opening, and the advantage in space is given to white by his pawn on e5. That pawn is controlling very important squares in black's camp, and by taking away those squares it makes it difficult for black to develop his pieces to active locations. However, black has inherited this position voluntarily, and he hopes to strike back against white's control of space by well-timed counterblows. Here we see the first counterblow. Black is hitting the d4 pawn, and probably a bit later on black is hoping to strike at white's centre by playing f6. So black is not too concerned about giving white a space advantage of this type in the opening. He's hoping to hit back a bit later on. However, Yudashin makes chess look like a very simple game in this example, and he simply consolidates his spatial advantage as we go through the opening moves. Black tries to shake off the advantage in space by creating counterplay. Bishop b4 check. What black is hoping for is that white will play bishop d2 in this position, and then who knows, maybe black is in a position to grab a pawn. But white can play king f2. This may look like a remarkable move to the beginner's eye, but in fact it's very logical. Black's bishop on b4 is left hanging in the air. White is waiting to gain time on that bishop with the move a3. The position is blocked up in the centre, and because white has an advantage in space, black actually finds it difficult to get his queenside pieces into the game and aggressively posted. So it's going to take black quite a lot of time to get those pieces going. Meanwhile, white consolidates his advantage in space and tries to build up a kingside attack. Alright, black tries to hit back with f6. White simply moves his king out of the way, and black castles. Now white plays his bishop out to d3. And the first point of this move is that if black takes the pawn on d4, he actually loses a piece. Well, it can be a very big piece if black takes with the queen, because white then has bishop takes h7 check. And if king takes h7, queen takes d4. So, by tactical means, white is still consolidating his space advantage. Black moves the bishop back to e7, and now white is able to protect d4 with knight e2. And now black plays a move I don't like very much, pawn up to g6. The idea of that is to block the diagonal of the bishop on d3, but I think already black is feeling his significant disadvantage in space. He can't actually see what to do. I think this is the problem. In order to activate his position, probably black's got to move his queen backwards, then he's got to move the knight, then he's probably going to move the bishop, then he'd have to move the queen again. It takes black an awful long time to unravel the queenside pieces. Meanwhile, because white has more space, he has a lot more options with his pieces. As you can see, it's easy to get the white pieces out to any location that they like. And so black decides to go fully on the defensive with g6. I don't like that move, as I say. I think it's too passive. It's purely defensive, and in general in chess you should avoid purely defensive moves wherever possible. Alright, bishop c2. Queen d8. And now white goes h4. The idea of that is fairly clear. White wants to get to grips with the black pawn formation on the king side, and now white's threatening h takes g6, bringing the rook into the game. White's idea, I think, is to attack the black king before the black queen side ever gets developed. And, well, black tries to block the position, which I think he should do, but still, white's spatial advantage is going to really mean something as we go through the next few moves. Now Yudashin plays a very deep move. Queen to g1. What he's thinking about doing is playing g4. Yes, I know he's probably going to have to move his king out of the way in order to do that, but he has plenty of time to do this, plenty of time to execute his plan, because black has no active idea in this position. He's still finding it incredibly difficult to unravel his queenside pieces. The main culprit, of course, is this pawn on e6 that's blocking in the entire queenside. Of course, in the French defence, you're occasionally going to get this type of position, but normally you would expect to have more counterplay than this. Black is without what we call counterplay, counter chances, and this is really fouling his game up. Okay, knight b6 was played. White took on g6. Queen takes g6. Going back, black can obviously capture back with the pawn, but I think the move he was afraid of was queen h2. Now white has a frightfully strong attack on the h file, and it's hard to see black being able to defend against these numerous threats. The main threat, of course, is queen h7 checkmate. Well, okay, black played queen takes g6 in the game. White played king f2. Black played bishop d7, slowly getting the queenside pieces out. And now the move white had been leading up to, g4. Everything is coming naturally from the spatial advantage. Rook ac8. The last piece comes into the game. It's much better to play a move like this than to be greedy with queen takes g4. I think after that, white would play the sly move queen h2, and the game would be over really. Black has too many problems defending his king. If he grovels, obviously white's threatening h7 in this position. If black just drops back with queen g7, I think white simply brings his bishop out. The rook comes across to g1, and black's goose will be cooked. All the white pieces are participating in the attack, and black's king looks very, very lonely on g8. So going back to g4, this is why black plays rook ac8. White opens up the game. Another rule of chess: open up the game when you're ahead in development. If you don't use time, the time afforded to you by your space advantage, the advantage might evaporate. So white opens up. He plays queen h2. Black gets his king out of harm's way, or so he thinks. Bishop d2, knight d8, and now rook ag1. A move we have been expecting for some time, and which is quite decisive. The black king is coming under a serious bombardment from white's queen and rooks, and well, black finally got his queenside developed, but the pieces are not in the right places really. Again, none of his queenside pieces are participating in the defence of his king. Well, queen f7, what else? And now a beautiful move, e6. We call this a clearance sacrifice. White is vacating the e5 square with his pawn. He gives black a pawn, but in return he gets the wonderful e5 square for his knight. And this really is a classic demonstration of how to play the attack. Black's queen is now overloaded. She can't defend h7 by natural means, so black has to sacrifice the queen with rook takes c2, but this can never be enough. Knight takes f7 check, rook takes f7, queen h5, attacking the rook, bishop e8, queen g6. Of course, black can't take this queen because the pawn is pinned on h7. Now white is threatening checkmate on g8. Black played the miserable move knight g5, and now a nice little finish to rook takes h7, a super move to finish off, and black resigned. Black is caught in several types of tactic. His knight is overloaded on g5. Of course, if he takes on h7, white has queen g8 checkmate. If he takes on h7 with the rook, white has queen takes e8, king g7, and then mops up the entire black army after queen takes e7 check. So black decided to resign. Excuse me. Well, that was a superb game by white. He established an advantage in space and time in the opening. Black was completely unable to shake this space advantage off, ran out of ideas, and then white crashed through with a winning attack. It won't always go as smoothly as this, but believe me, a spatial advantage in a chess game really does mean something. Pawns are the soul of chess. So said Philidor a long time ago, and his words ring true even today. If you do not look after your pawns, and in particular your pawn structure, you're well on the way to losing the game. Now, in a subsequent DVD on this series, I'm going to be going into the idea of pawn structure in a lot more detail. But for the time being, let's take a look at a game which will help you to understand the importance of the way pawns affect a game of chess as a whole. Master players take note of the fact that pawns cannot move backwards, and they make every pawn move with care. You frequently see beginners, newcomers to the game, moving their pawns forward at high speed without a care in the world. But every pawn move has to be considered with care. This is all I will say for the time being. Pawn structure determines strategy. That is the mantra we will take with us as we close this DVD and move on to number 2. But let me show you a game from the World Championship match in 1908. A very old game, but one which demonstrates how important it is to think about pawn structure from the very earliest stages of the game. Two great players contest this epic. Emanuel Lasker is playing with white, and Siegbert Tarrasch is playing with black. And the opening is one of the most famous openings in chess, the Ruy Lopez, where white plays bishop b5, black plays a6, and white takes on c6, doubling black's pawns. Now Lasker played d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4. And when you see the subsequent course of this game, you begin to wonder why black should ever go in for this position. Because the fact is, white has a winning pawn structure already in this position. It has been proven that white's kingside majority, 4 pawns against 3, is able to create a passed pawn, whereas black's majority on the queen side, if white plays carefully, is not able to do the same thing. So what white would like in this position is to systematically exchange off all the pieces and then stroll to victory in the endgame. Black, for his part, is relying on the open nature of the position. Black has 2 strong bishops, and he's really got to try to use these bishops actively in the opening and in the early middle game to compensate for this fact that actually he's probably got a lost endgame. Now, the clarity of this variation from white's point of view makes it appeal to a lot of strategical players. White understands that what he's looking for basically in this position is to create a passed pawn on the king side and to exchange pieces, and he's single-mindedly got to stick to that theme. Black should understand that to exchange pieces and to go into bad endgames is folly in a position of this type, so he's got to keep active and use his bishops. So the struggle is defined, and let's see how at the highest level of chess both players shape up for this encounter. Well, for the time being, black plays well. He stations his bishop actively, he forces a slight concession from white, and now Tarrasch continues to develop his pieces. I'm not at all sure about this manoeuvre though, this bishop e7 to f6, because it really gives white all he wants, an exchange of pieces at an early stage. And so I imagine, coming out of the opening, with both sides castling, white was marginally the more happy. He's still got his kingside pawn majority, he's managed to exchange off a pair of pieces, and black doesn't seem to have an enormous amount of counterplay. Well, Tarash plays rook d7, white goes knight f4. This really is quite an easy game to understand, despite the fact it's being played at World Championship level, because we know the aims of both players. Black is trying to stay in the middle game, white is trying to effect a favourable transposition to the endgame. Now comes another exchange of pieces on d7. White is delighted with that, and white plays rook d1. Tarash plays knight e5, and once again white is absolutely delighted with this exchange, and now Lasker moves in with c4, blocking off the queenside pawn position. Now it's pretty clear to me that at this point Tarash was probably thinking, well, I've almost certainly gone wrong here. This is not a lost position for black, but it's very difficult. The action is now going to take place almost exclusively on the king side. The problem for black is he's got no counterplay, he's got no way of distracting white from the obvious plan of creating a passed pawn on that flank. And really, white now unhurriedly improves his position over the next few moves, and black can't do a single thing about it. The white rook makes room for the king to come up into a nice position in the centre. Obviously white's got to take note of black tactics. You know, the black bishop was attacking the knight, so the knight had to move. But the king comes up to e3, and now the knight starts to probe again from h5. In order to create a passed pawn, white's got to advance his pawns. Black can do nothing. The white rook, we should note, is actually cutting the black king out of the game. So the action's taking place on the king side. We're looking to create a passed pawn there for white. White plays his knight back to g3. F takes e4. Knight takes e4. And now bishop f5. Is black thinking of perhaps taking the knight on e4? Well, says white, you can jolly well do so if you like. The point being that if bishop takes e4, white has his passed pawn after f takes e4. White is effectively a pawn up in this position because these pawns are actually frozen by white's pawns on a4, b3 and c4. Yes, white is effectively a passed pawn up, but more than that, he has an active king, and the black king is cut off on the c file. So black is probably lost in this position. Hence, after h5, black played rook d7. Perhaps surprisingly, white decided to refrain from the exchange of rooks after rook c3. I mean, I think rook takes d7 was also possible, and then play king f4. I mean, this also looks good for white to me. Not sure why Lasker didn't do that, but we'll see that actually white handles the rest of the game very confidently. He brings his king up. Perhaps he just didn't want to allow the black king into the game for the time being. Rook goes to h1, bit of counterplay, but well, all that black has succeeded in doing is further activating white's king. This game is really very easy to understand. You know, white systematically improves his position all the way through the game. Now we see the creation of the passed pawn coming up very clearly after f6. F takes f6, g takes f6, and now king takes f6. And once again, black has problems with his king. White's going to create that passed pawn. The king on d8 is cut off. This endgame is lost. Bishop e8. Knight f5. Rook f4. And now the culmination of white's entire game plan, g6. This is what we call a passed pawn. A pawn that cannot be opposed by enemy pawns. That pawn is heading towards g8 when it will become a new queen and win the game for white. So black tries to stop it with rook g4. But now, as usual, a superior position gives you the chance to make combinations. And Lasker hit Tarash with the superb move rook takes e8. Not an obvious move at first sight, but g7 reveals white's true intention. The black king's cut off, and white's plan, very simply, is to bring the knight to g6, after which the black rook will be completely cut off from the pawn. So black is lost. He tried a few tricks after rook takes g7, king takes g7, king e6. It looks as though black might have some chance, threatening to invade on the king side and gobble up the white pawns, but Lasker has it all under control. King f7, king e4. It turns out the white can even offer the knight to black. If king takes f3 in this position, the white king has a field day on the black pawns. So going back to the game, king d3, king d6, king c3, king takes c6, king takes b3, and now the move Lasker had envisaged all along, king b5. After which nothing, no force on earth can stop the white knight from mopping up. Knight e5, knight d7, and then knight takes b6 will be the first stage in the process of taking every single black pawn. So a very clear-cut game, which, well, where black's defeat really stemmed from his poor opening play. Tarrasch didn't really attend to the needs of his position. He got a losing pawn structure out of the opening, and then he started swapping off. No good. Now, as I say, I'll be discussing pawn structure in a bit more depth on a subsequent DVD, but for the time being I hope you enjoyed DVD 1, Basic Chess, and that you'll proceed with me now to DVD 2.